This is the new Volvo ES90, and it's not quite what I had expected. You see, instead of giving us a traditional sedan, Volvo has given us kind of a lifted sedan, maybe ES90 cross country. However you want to describe it, this is a hatchback, and it's about 4 inches taller than the S90 that it's not going to replace, because the S90 is getting a refresh with the grille from the recently refreshed XC90. Now, if I accidentally confuse my X's and my C's and my S's in this video, I apologize, because we're dealing with the alphabet soup of the various different Volvo models. Let's talk about what's new and why you might want to wait for this long-range Volvo hatchback, fastback, sedan thing, especially if you're looking for something with incredible range and really fast charging. First, let's talk about the size. When Volvo said that this was going to be built on the SPA 2 platform, which underpins the new EX90, the electric XC90 sort of replacement, I had assumed that maybe they would keep the shorter wheelbase that we find in the EX90, but they did not. They actually stretched that wheelbase out to 122.1 inches. That's about 1.5 inches longer than the current generation S90. And I have to mention that the S90 that we get now is the extended wheelbase S90. When it first launched, it was more 5 Series or E-Class sized of that era, but Volvo gave it a pretty significant stretch, and basically every S90 now is the stretched model at over 200 inches long. This is going to be shorter, even though we have that longer wheelbase and they're saying notably more legroom than we get in the S90. They've really tightened the proportion in the rear, giving it that more sportback look and that really truncated trunklet looking thing on the hatch. This is 196.9 inches long. And I think that's why the proportions look peculiar to some people's eye, because even though the doors are actually relatively long, it doesn't appear that they're quite as long as in the S90. And then we have that really short trunk overhang behind, and then that taller roofline, again about 4 inches taller. This should give the passengers inside, of course, more headroom, but a lot of that room is likely simply due to the battery pack. But before we get to that, let's talk about the rest of the design. I think that most folks were pretty accurate in their depiction of the front end of the ES90. It looks very similar to the EX90, quite logically, because this is the modern Volvo aesthetic. Those Thor hammer headlights are definitely the latest interpretation of that. We have the LiDAR module, of course, just above the windshield on the top of the roof module, just like we see in the EX90. And then if we go around to the back, you'll notice one kind of quirky thing. We have the typical C-shaped taillights that we've seen in Volvo sedans for a while, but on top of that, we have some additional lights that look like they're integrated into the rear window that definitely mimic what's going on in, say, the Volvo EX30. Some of the more recent Volvo hatchback, sedan, kind of crossover-y things, whatever you want to call some of these vehicles that are blending lines, like the Volvo C40, recently renamed the EC40, which also has some similar stripes climbing up the hatch. Now let's dive into some of the technical details, because we know a decent amount more than we knew before, but we don't know everything yet about Volvo's new 800-volt architecture. And yes, this is going to be an 800-volt architecture, so oddly enough, it is not going to directly share motors or inverters or batteries with the EX90. I would not be surprised if the EX90 got some tweaks, however, in relatively short order, so that way all of these are using more similar components. It also makes me wonder what's going to happen in the Polestar lineup if Polestar 3 is going to get an upgrade at some point, but we'll talk about that later. The main battery pack that I think people are going to be interested in is the big model, and that's going to be in the dual motor versions of the ES90. That's 106 kilowatt hours gross, 102 kilowatt hours usable. So again, not the same capacity that we find in the EX90. Then there's going to be a smaller battery pack in the rear wheel drive model. I am sad that they didn't give us the bigger battery pack in the rear wheel drive model for even more range, but we can't have everything. That battery pack is 92 kilowatt hours gross, 88 kilowatt hours usable. Both of these are going to be 800-volt nominal packs, and they're both going to charge very rapidly. Volvo is saying that the peak charge rate on the bigger battery pack is going to be 350 kilowatts peak. Now, they are saying that's the charge rate, at least for now. They're not saying you have to connect to a 350 kilowatt charger to get the fastest rate, like some manufacturers have said. They're basically claiming 350. The smaller battery pack, that's going to charge a little bit slower. They're saying 300. Of course, it remains to be seen exactly what kind of charge rates we see out of these batteries, but it's probably not going to hang on to that 300 kilowatt mark for very long. It is, however, going to average very rapid speeds because they're saying that these batteries will go 10% to 80% in just 20 minutes. That could make these one of the fastest charging batteries around, really rivaling what we see from Lucid and, of course, from Porsche. On the overly generous WLTP scale, they're saying in 10 minutes of charging, you could get 186 miles of range. And that would, of course, be for the longest range ES90 model, which is going to be the rear-wheel drive version, 329 horsepower, 354 pound-feet of torque on the rear axle. Yep, Volvo's going back to rear-wheel drive. And that model, according to the WLTP, should be rated for about 435 miles of driving range. By the time this gets EPA rated, I suspect that the different versions of ES90 are going to be between 340 and 370 miles of range. But any way you slice it, we're talking really excellent range for what is basically a lifted sedan kind of format. Now, if 329 horsepower is not enough for you, that will go 0 to 60 in 6.7 seconds, by the way, then you want the 442 horsepower dual motor version, 494 pound-feet of torque combined on that one. That will get you 0 to 60 in 5.3 seconds. And if that's still not enough for you, you want the 670 horsepower Volvo with 635 pound-feet of torque that will go 0 to 60 in a claimed 3.9 seconds. But like every Volvo on sale, it's going to be speed limited to 112 miles an hour as far as the top speed because Volvo cares about safety. Well, safety, wink, wink, nod, nod with 670 horsepower. One thing missing from Volvo's tech release here is any mention of the twin clutch rear axle unit that we find in the EX90. I'm really curious to see if that comes to the ES90 because I think it's all kinds of fantastic in the Polestar 3 and the EX90, which both share that rear axle and drive motor unit. Basically, it acts like a torque vectoring and lockup differential in the back, and it really is noticeable in the impact it has on driving. It really makes the bigger Volvo and that big Polestar feel far more nimble than you might suspect out on the road. I really hope that the ES90 gets it, but we just don't know yet. I think the interior is a little bit less controversial than the exterior, but there are still a few controversial elements, like the fact that it appears we're going to get just 2 window switches like we find in the EX90, so that same pair of switches is going to be used for operating both windows. We also find the same button minimalism going on inside that we find in the EX90, like some of the multi-use buttons on the steering wheel, the shifter stalk that also activates the cruise control, features like that are kind of combined. I don't find that to be too much of a problem, although I do wish the instrument cluster was maybe just a little bit bigger, but at least we have one. The instrument cluster screen and the center 14 approximate inch screen basically seem to be shared with the EX90, but the software and the hardware behind it is actually a next generation software and hardware package. This is using the latest processors from NVIDIA, so they're promising more responsiveness, more future-proofing, and greater functionality generally speaking, although we don't have too many details on that just yet. The rest of the interior, it's basically what you'd expect from Volvo. Relatively restrained styling, definitely Scandinavian modern, lots of open pore wood, so unlike some car companies that have really been abandoning wood trim, we definitely find a lot here inside the ES90. We find very similar headrests and seat designs to the EX90 as well. Ambient lighting that appears to shine through those wooden panels, also a feature that we find in that larger SUV as well. The back seats, each seat folds, so it is a 20-40-20 or 40-20-40 folding rear seat back, however you want to apportion that. It's not quite 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, but it does improve functionality as far as carrying larger cargo inside. And we're going to get 4-zone automatic climate control in the rear. The big addition for Volvo, I think, is the inclusion of an electrochromatic moonroof. The glass roof appears to be standard, but if you don't like just that big pane of glass above your head, there is an electrochromatic function like we find in the Rivian lineup, the Rivian R1S and R1T lately, where you can actually tint it at the touch of a button. That's definitely a feature that I love. Now, unfortunately, at this point in time, we don't have a lot of the detailed specifications that you might expect, like legroom and headroom figures. We do know some cargo room numbers, but I would caution that in Europe, they don't measure cargo room the same way, so it would appear that we have a somewhat small 14 cubic foot cargo area behind. That's likely because in Europe, they do not count the area of that cargo area above the rear seat back. So that entire triangle between the glass and the bottom is not counted. And in the US, we would include that in cargo room figures in hatchback-like vehicles. So It's probably a little bit bigger. We also don't know exactly the size of the front trunk, but because this is built on the SPA2 platform with the EX90, it's likely that that front trunk area is not as accommodating as you might hope. Because this platform is at least distantly related to the SPA1 platform, Volvo is not really specific on relationships here. They're kind of cagey. They say this is a dedicated EV platform, but when you really look at it and you look at especially the way the firewall is shaped on the inside and what's going on under the covers in that front trunk area, it certainly seems like it's sharing a great deal of crash structure, maybe suspension design up front, maybe some of the firewall with the SPA1 vehicles, which were of course originally designed for hybrids and regular ICE drivetrains. The major change for SPA2 appears to be the way the battery is integrated into the lower floor. So I suspect SPA2 is kind of a hybrid where the front end and the firewall, etc., is very similar to SPA1. Obviously not exactly the same, but similar. And then the back end, suspension, etc., may be similar to SPA1, but everything in between, where the motors mount and the battery pack area and all of that, is likely unique to SPA2. That's likely why we have a flat floor in the back of this, like we have a flat floor in the back of the Polestar 3 and the EX90, but then we do have that somewhat prominent hump in the front and not quite a flat floor between the driver and the front passenger. Instead, we get a slightly different kind of storage area in the front than we find in the EX90. It's a bit difficult in these pictures to show you exactly, but we get two big cup holders. We get what looks like perhaps one wireless charging mat with another phone holder next to it, and then a little console area above that that appears not to be a separate storage area, but perhaps just a location for the volume knob for the infotainment system. And then, of course, more wood trim, with the rest of that wood trim and leather all wrapping around everything on the inside. The interior design definitely seems to be a highlight for this in terms of build quality and parts quality. This does look pretty good. Obviously, I haven't seen it in person, but that's what we've come to expect from Volvo. Very Scandinavian modern, lots of open pore wood trim, lots of leather dripping on everything. I think as far as that goes, Volvo has done an excellent job. What's unclear, though, is whether or not this will actually make it to the United States. It's going to be a long-range EV, and I think that does hold some interest for a lot of Americans, but it's obvious that bigger and more expensive EV sedans haven't exactly been jumping off the shelves, whether we're talking about the Lucid or the Tesla Model S or really any of the other EV sedans that have come out recently. I think the public has spoken, and they seem to want EV SUVs. Also, Volvo doesn't say whether or not they plan to build this in the United States, so obviously tariffs are something that could be concerning with the build of this. The battery pack is likely coming from China, although we don't know exactly where the ES90 will be built at this point in time. We do, however, know that if you're in Europe or a number of other countries around the world, you should be able to order your ES90 now, and other markets will be added either later in 2025 or in 2026. So it may be an entire year before we find out whether or not we will ever get the ES90 in America. Let me know down there whether you are interested in it. I do appreciate that Volvo is looking towards efficiency and practicality with this. They've also kind of promised that we might get some wagons. An electric wagon would definitely be kind of cool, maybe an EV90, something like that. Who knows what the future holds. But be sure and let us all know down there, and see all of you later.